Hello humans, abolitionists, hedonic treadmill runners, negative utilitarians, techno-Buddhists, wire headers and monistic physicalists, and welcome to The Good Timeline. The Good Timeline is the place where we examine the global trend of transhumanism, the self-directed transformation of humans into something very different from our hunter-gatherer ancestors, and how we might best make that transition. My name's Ryan Ferris, and today's guest is transhumanist philosopher and co-founder of Humanity Plus, David Pearce. David has been a significant voice in the transhumanist movement globally and holds compelling views on the direction civilization should be headed, especially in regards to the reduction and elimination of involuntary suffering. We discuss the Abolitionist Project, negative utilitarianism, cultured meat and the end of factory farming, CRISPR gene editing in humans, the intersection of Buddhist ethics with secular philosophy, the relationship between happiness, suffering, and meaning, AI-generated art and music, identity, David's views on cryonics, and a bunch more. Enjoy. So I'd like to dive a bit into your origin story to begin with, and I believe there was someone called Snowball who had a significant influence on your thinking at an early age.
This is my brother's guinea pig. The saddest event in my brother's life was when his guinea pig died shortly after giving birth, and I wanted to put Snowdrop in the freezer so that she could be reanimated at a later date, but this idea was vetoed by my mother. But yes, from an early age I've been interested in what I would now call the three supers of transhumanism. That's super longevity, super intelligence, and super happiness. And yes, they're interconnected in all sorts of ways. But yes, of course, it's an anecdote now. It's just a guinea pig. But the death of a pet for a child it can be extremely traumatic.
Had you come across any sort of literature on cryogenics or cryonics at that age to have? How did you come up with this idea that freezing and reanimating would be a possibility at that age?
I'd read Robert Ettinger, The Prospect of Immortality. And this, it must have been about 12 or 13, and this struck me as more credible than my earlier plan at the age of 7 or 8 to find a cure for the aging process by the time I was 18. Why 18? Because I'd somehow stumbled across this ancient notion that one lost 2,000 brain cells a day after the age of 18, after which it was downhill all the way. And yes, by my early teens, I'd recognised that it was probably unrealistic that I was going to find a cure for the aging process, whereas cryonics was rather more credible.
Were there any other significant events or people that pushed you towards the path of transhumanism?
This is it. Digging deep into one's past. I'm a fourth generation vegetarian. 3 of my 8 great-grandparents were vegetarian, as far as I know. All 4 grandparents, both parents. So that strand of transhumanism, concern for the suffering, not just of humans and non-humans, was part of my cultural heritage. My grandparents were religious, which I'm not, but nonetheless, yes, from at an early age, I was preoccupied by the problem of suffering in humans and non-humans. I used to try to rescue ants and worms when I was about 4 or 5 that had been trodden on. But yes, it would be fanciful to say that, obviously at such a tender year I'd anticipated transhumanism. But in terms of values, concern for the problem of suffering, how to get rid of suffering, worries about the nature of death and aging, and though this came rather later, preoccupation with ways to amplify intelligence. Yes, one can trace roots.
Mm-hmm. And do you have any idea what may have informed your grandparents' views on ethics and morality and these sorts of things that eventually led to you heading to this path?
Well, my very eccentric paternal grandmother was an anthroposophist. In the year 1930, she converted from Zoroastrianism to anthroposophy and became a vegetarian at that time. The other side of the family are Quaker roots, and though not all Quakers are vegetarian, nonetheless it's pretty close to a kind of a Quaker ethos. But yes, I mean this concern for the well-being of all sentience is ancient. It's not peculiar to any Christian religious tradition. One can find it in religions of the Indian subcontinent. But what's new, of course, is biotechnology and AI and the actual tools to turn what is otherwise just religious utopian dreaming into some kind of feasible blueprint for a happy biosphere.
And where are we at with that currently? And who would you say, or who in your mind is pushing the boundaries the most, whether that be a country or a city or a group of people?
Good heavens. Well, I normally start with the World Health Organization, which has this wonderfully ambitious definition of health in its founding constitution of 1948, and it's reaffirmed it. Health as a state of complete physical, mental, social well-being, not merely an absence of disease and infirmity. And this is an extraordinarily radical conception of health. Realistically, I think we should be aiming for information-sensitive gradients of well-being, not perfect well-being as so described. But yes, in terms of the science, really it's a case of combining social, economic, political reform with biological genetic interventions. I mean, both are absolutely critical. In that, insofar as we want to reduce the burden of suffering in the world today, most straightforward intervention we could make would be to shut outlaw factory farms and slaughterhouses. Nothing exotic relating to biotech. But in terms of actually phasing out the biology of suffering throughout the living world, this is going to take serious genetic interventions to recalibrate the hedonic treadmill, to ratchet up pain tolerance. One of the big developments of the past few decades has been decoding the genome. Increasing number of genomes of organisms have now been decoded, and I think the next step for humans is going to be universal access to pre-implantation genetic screening and counselling for all prospective babies, and also, yes, the use of CRISPR genome editing technologies. We've seen the first CRISPR babies in China, not conceived in ideal circumstances, and not with any ambitious program for the well-being of all sentience in mind, but genetic interventions to tweak even a handful of genes relating to pain sensitivity, recalibrating the hedonic treadmill could massively improve well-being, recalibrate the hedonic treadmill, and ensure that our default quality of life of all new people is dramatically higher. Other strands of the Abolitionist Project, realistically, although I was saying that I think we should shut and outlaw slaughterhouses, the cultured meat revolution needs to be accelerated. So yes, I would hope to see cultured meat and animal products in the stores within the next 5, 10, 15 years. I would hope that the cultured meat revolution will sociologically, this is sociologically realistic to talk about shutting factory farms, slaughterhouses, if essentially genetically identical products, cruelty-free, are widely available and cheap, and that's absolutely critical. The final stage there of the Abolitionist Project here on Earth is going to be suffering in nature, which is truly immense, and intuitively the problem is too vast to tackle. I mean, perhaps one can imagine helping large terrestrial vertebrates like elephants, but intuitively, how on earth are we going to help obscure marine invertebrates and fast-breeding rodents? But what really blindsided me was the advent of technologies of synthetic gene drives, which cheat the laws of Mendelian inheritance and allow desired traits to be spread through entire populations of free living animals, even if the trait in question appears to have a fitness cost to the individual. This technology is going to be used probably to defeat vector-borne disease like malaria. But in principle, at any rate, one could use these technologies to spread benign copies of desired genes across entire species of sexually reproducing organism. And it's actually easier in that sense to help the small, fast breeders than large vertebrates such as elephants. So yeah, in theory it would be possible, and I stress in theory, it would be technically possible to have a kind of 100-year blueprint to phase out suffering throughout the living world and replace the biology of pain, suffering and depression with an informational economy of mind based on gradients of intelligent bliss. I'm glossing over all sorts of pitfalls, but nonetheless, the technology is becoming available. I mean, it's not just utopian wishful thinking. We're living in the last century of suffering that is unavoidable. I mean, if there were some kind of global consensus for getting rid of suffering, it could be gone in 100 years.
Who would you say, or which group are pushing the most for this change, and where is the political will to move forward on this? Because as far as I understand it, the political will globally isn't so transhumanist. It is in some measures. On the side of medicine, people are very for sort of transhumanist developments, but for pure enhancement, there still seems to be a lot of conservatism. So where do you see the political will? I don't think it's going to happen. Well, I don't think it'll happen under the banner of transhumanism, and it won't happen under the banner of enhancement. It's going to be done under the label of remediation. What counts as remediation and what counts as enhancement. But if we use this ambitious World Health Organization definition of health, then everything we're talking about is remediation. The important qualification, I mean, it sounds a bit of a mouthful, replacing the biology of suffering with information sensitive of gradients of well-being, is that if one was simply to have
indiscriminate physical well-being or indiscriminate emotional or social well-being. There's a loss of critical insights, high function. It would ask people to give up their existing values, preference architecture, whereas the advantage of ratcheting up hedonic set points and pain thresholds is that this is consistent with existing value systems, both religious and secular. Religious people don't object waking up in the morning in an extremely good mood and pain-free or with only minimal useful nociceptive function. Whereas if one starts trying to design a perfect world, a perfect society in which everyone is completely happy, this involves overriding all sorts of preferences and values, and would also technically be much more ambitious. One of the things I think that's worth doing is studying today's genetic outliers. Although people with chronic pain disorders or severe depression, they are studied much more. At the opposite extreme, there are extremely high-functioning people who have extremely high pain thresholds and extremely high hedonic set points. And yes, though looking much further forward to the future, one can imagine a civilization based on gradients of super-intelligent bliss. Ratcheting up our default well-being to the level of today's hedonic outliers would be an excellent stepping stone to a truly post-human society.
And pragmatically speaking, you've written about some genetic SNPs and variants that seem to hint at these ways in which we could bring this about at the genetic level, right? This isn't just purely speculation. There are some.
No. This is it. Something like the SCN9A gene. Nonsense mutations abolish the capacity not merely to feel pain but also nociception. And it's particularly disastrous if you're a risk-taking male if you can't feel pain. But as well as nonsense mutations that abolish the raw feels of pain and the function of nociception, there are dozens and dozens of alleles of SCN9A which confer either unusually high or unusually low pain thresholds. So in principle, prospective parents can choose already the level of pain sensitivity of their future offspring. Now, as an empirical fact, people who have high pain thresholds or don't experience pain at all tend to be very cheerful. But there are other genes associated that, as far as we know, have associated with normal pain sensitivity, but are associated with having an unusually high hedonic set point. High hedonic set point is this approximate default level of well-being or ill-being that most people go through in the course of a lifetime. And by choosing particular benign variants of COMT or the FAR gene, far out gene, it'll be possible to ensure that all future offspring are born with benign pain thresholds and an extremely sunny, happy, optimistic temperament. Now, this isn't the same as the complete abolition of any form of experience below hedonic zero. I mean, that is my guess for the long-term future of civilization. Indeed, long-term future I would see as gradients of super-intelligent bliss. But in terms of a realistic implementation of some kind of 100-year plan to defeat all but the most trivial forms of suffering, I would, as I said, a big start will be making sure that all prospective parents can actually choose, with the help of counsellors, but choose the makeup of their kids. Now, one very natural response here is, well, isn't this eugenics, designer babies? But all children born today are unique, untested genetic experiments. And if you do consider it ethically permissible to conduct untested genetic experiments and bring new suffering into the world, I think you have a moral obligation to, at the very least, load the genetic dice in your children's favour. And this is precisely what pre-implantation genetic screening, counselling, and now CRISPR genome editing offers.
I'd like to get to a bit of anti-natalism in a wee while, but before we get there, will these genetic alterations be limited to babies, or is this something that we're likely to see in the next 20, 30 years with the use of CRISPR-Cas9 or similar technologies? In other words, could one actually alter one's own genetic makeup to make oneself more hypothymic or increase their pain tolerance?
Yes, I mean, this is already being done in so-called animal models, and biohacking will be possible for humans too. But all kinds of technical challenges as well as ethical dilemmas there for existing people. And at least with the current state of technology, using drugs is easier than gene therapies. The drugs are also likely to be shorter acting and their effects are reversible. Inevitably, in the course of a podcast or an interview, one is glossing all kinds of, as I said, risks, unknown side effects, pitfalls, you name it. But yeah, in principle, recursively self-improving organic robots, i.e. humans, are going to be able to kind of bootstrap our way out of the abyss of Darwinian life. But it's timescales. I mean, there are some transhumanists who will tell you a very rosy story of something like the technological singularity, and it's going to be happening in the next 10, 15, 20, 30 years. Although there will be astonishing breakthroughs and kind of revolutionary interventions, I realistically think that the transformation of humanity is into becoming transhuman and then post-human. It's going to take place over centuries and millennia.
Yeah. Wikipedia describes you as a negative utilitarian, and that sort of places a lot of the focus on suffering. What is your personal experience of suffering, and how and when did it become so compelling to you?
Suffering has always loomed larger in my life and imagination than pleasure. One needs to be careful that when one is talking about the future and life and civilization, one is not simply generalizing about one's own idiosyncratic experience. But sadly, for evolutionary reasons, suffering, or at least large periods of suffering, sometimes quite atrocious suffering, has been the norm for many, perhaps most organisms through ever since the Cambrian. So yeah, I don't think this is some purely personal narrative. Why a negative utilitarian? Everyone can agree this is an extremely lousy brand, but it's really a formalization of a secular Buddhist ethic, which says that we have an overriding ethical obligation to minimize, mitigate, and prevent suffering, and this obligation trumps any kind of obligation to or desire to make happy people even happier. I mean, that's fantastic. As I said, I look forward to a biohappiness revolution and gradients of superhuman bliss, but the real moral urgency is tackling the problem of suffering. And why is suffering so morally urgent? Well, hopefully all of your listeners are feeling comfortable, relaxed, not in physical pain, not personally depressed, but if one is in intense pain or one is suffering, undergoing extreme suffering, then one doesn't need to explain the moral urgency of getting rid of it. And essentially negative utilitarianism, suffering-focused ethics, Buddhism without some of the scientifically untenable metaphysics. It underpins my own world picture. But one needn't buy into negative utilitarianism or anything like it to believe that it would be a good idea if we phased out involuntary suffering and indeed created a world in which any experience below hedonic zero was been relegated to evolutionary history. But negative utilitarians, what is morally important for them is suffering. Everything else is going to be icing on the cake.
Yeah. And what I'm trying to get to with that question is, I understand the academic David Pearce side of negative utilitarianism, but I'd like to, if permissible, understand the more personal side of David Pearce and what makes suffering so compelling for you. Was there a moment or an experience or a story or something that really hit it home for you? Because I think there are some people that don't, perhaps these hypothalamic individuals or people with high pain tolerances, for example, that perhaps don't place such a high priority on suffering, and often these views are initially informed by our own personal experience on what we place priority to in the world. So I'm wondering if you have anything there, so we can learn a little bit more about you yourself and not David Pearce, the academic, as such.
As Andrei Gromyko, ex-Soviet foreign minister, once said, "My personality does not interest me." This is it. I'm not hiding some racy or fascinating anecdotes from you. It's, in some sense, I feel that it's a distraction. I mean, really. As I said, I was a melancholic, introspective teenager, appalled by the existence of suffering in the world, and thinking, I thought, sort of long and hard about how one might get rid of it. But there wasn't any single traumatic event that scarred me and transformed my world picture.
Okay, fair enough.
Sorry, that is in terms of actual content for your podcast. Yes, something a little spicier would probably be more fun. But
no, it's honest, and that's great.
I'm not. David Benatar, for example, never allows his photo to be taken. I'm not, secretive like that. I mean, I wouldn't look at myself in the mirror or anything. But I just think the personal anecdotal is a distraction. That sure, in one sense, I hope some larger than life charismatic billionaire makes the Abolitionist Project their own. Elon Musk says, let's use biotechnology to abolish suffering instead of this stupid 10 trillion project for a colony on Mars or something. So in that sense, I think personalities are important because some larger than life personality can take the project forward. But otherwise, the personal is a distraction.
Yeah, I mean, people love a story and they love a myth. We're very story-based mythical creatures, right? So they enjoy a bit of both, I think, and sometimes that can make things more compelling. But I totally get it from a purely logical, reductive standpoint of what makes sense to do, and pragmatically, I'm pretty in line with your philosophy in that regard. You've spoken on the Ipsis happiness survey, which is a global survey on sort of baseline happiness and higher happiness and lower happiness in the world, which has its own measurement problems. But is the assumption that humans are at baseline frustrated and discontented perhaps a bias inferred from life in post-agricultural civilization, and specifically the cloudy United Kingdom?
In this Ipsos happiness survey that I sometimes quote, a few years old now, but unlike other surveys, it didn't try to adjust for such measures as the people conducting the survey thought ought to make people happy, kind of infant mortality, life expectancy, corruption in society. It's just asking people, right now, do you feel sad, so-so, quite happy, very happy? And the top was Indonesia for very happy, followed by India, followed by Mexico. And the reason for quoting this isn't to suggest that somehow most people in India or peasants leading backbreaking life in the fields are something that all of us should emulate. It just conveys just how powerful the hedonic treadmill is that stops most people being very happy or very unhappy for long. That a lot of the time, certainly being discontented can be adaptive. Being discontented, wanting more, whether more wealth, more status, more reproductive opportunities, it's good for our genes, even if it psychologically isn't good for us. And if one has got this gene's eye view of the world, one can see why that essentially nature hasn't designed most of us to be sustainably happy. And there are people who are essentially in the course of a lifetime, essentially sail through life. But as countless other examples attest, most lives are at some stage or other marked by quite horrendous suffering, whether an unhappy love affair, the loss of family members, bereavement. In the course of a single lifetime, even people who are pretty happy are likely to experience all manner of atrocious stuff. We need to tackle the biological genetic sources of suffering as well as the social environmental stuff, because we for the past goodness knows how many centuries, millennia, dreamers, visionaries, utopians have ideas for a better world, countless forms of environmental manipulation, social, political reform, ideas on free love, social justice. And are we, on average today, happier than our ancestors, hunter-gatherer ancestors on the African savannah? There's no real evidence that this is the case. Now, this shouldn't be taken as evidence that any kind of environmental manipulation is futile. I can think of all kinds of ways that we can intervene politically, socially, economically to make a better world. But if we are ethically serious, we've got to tackle our ugly genetic source code, which is incredibly sinister. And as a gift from heaven, biotechnology has now given us the tools for the job.
Yeah. Do you agree with the sort of paleo-modernists that believe that the fall from grace for humanity was the agricultural revolution, and that the standard of living and general level of happiness were much higher before we invented farming and civilization?
I'd hesitate to say much higher, but nonetheless, if you look at physical stature and the record we have of humans who lived after the agricultural revolution, looking at purely physical indices, it's harder to intuit people's mental states. Then if they are a reliable proxy, then yes, subjective well-being may have declined, even though human populations were much larger. But the hedonic treadmill is protective to some extent, but only to some extent.
Yeah. I read on your core somewhere quote, take care of happiness and the meaning of life will take care of itself. Can you expand on this?
Yeah, I'm normally very suspicious of little kind of aphorisms, but I honestly, this really does, I think, convey an important truth, in that a lot of people critics will say, the Jordan Petersons, what counts isn't happiness or getting rid of suffering, it's meaning. But what drains life of meaning and significance and purpose is suffering. I mean, slipping into depression is associated with a lot of interest and enjoyment, anhedonia, slipping into melancholia, and maybe into nihilism, despair, suicidal thoughts. Yet if one switches the hedonic dials in the other direction, life becomes much more meaningful and significant. And one can see pathological instances today in cases of something like euphoric mania. If someone has euphoric mania, everything seems profoundly meaningful and significant. Euphoric mania can be associated with religious delusions, even theomania, belief one is God or divinely inspired, belief one can save the world. It's not what we want for a society, but nonetheless, as a purely empirical fact, if we ratchet up hedonic range and hedonic set points, then everyone will find life much more meaningful and significant. No one says, I feel blissfully happy, but my life feels empty and meaningless. And so, yes, if one looks forward to transhuman and then post-human society, it's not merely that they will enjoy happiness that is far greater than anything physiologically possible today. The level of meaning, significance, and purpose in transhuman and post-human lives will be probably orders of magnitude richer too. Now, does this sense of meaning and purpose have any transcendent significance? I'm personally skeptical, but in terms of radically increasing the abundance of meaning, of meaningful lives that are charged with a sense of significance and purpose, the way to do this is biological genetic interventions. This route doesn't involve adjudicating between conflicting preferences, because the problem with so many people's attempts at meaning and significance today is that it comes at the expense of others. We are social primates, and so many of our desires and preferences involve frustrating the desires and preferences of others. Whereas if we ratchet up hedonic set points and hedonic range, one will also ratchet up meaning and significance.
That's interesting, because you mentioned the euphoric mania and how that person in that subjective state may feel like everything is incredibly significant. They may feel like they're on a quest from God or something along those lines. And that meaning is going to hit a wall, which that wall would be consensus reality and society and societal norms. There must be some kind of interaction, if we're discussing meaning, between pure subjective well-being and the sort of societal well-being, right? So there must be some kind of alignment of goals and purposes and meaning for meaning to actually have a long-term effect.
Yes, essentially, if we were to engineer, which would be technically feasible, if we were to engineer lifelong bliss via wireheading or its pharmacological equivalent, or indeed if we were to engineer euphoric mania, which would also be possible, it would, for example, rob all relationships of any kind of Meaning, if you were indiscriminately happy all the time, then if a friend encountered some kind of misfortune, then essentially it wouldn't dent your well-being. It would make human lives, human relationships. It would, rob them of any kind of real emotional depth. Whereas, if we aim instead to ratchet up hedonic set points, then if, for example, I experience some misfortune, let's assume for now that not even utopian transhumanist technologies have abolished all forms of misfortune, then if I'm your friend and I have some kind of misfortune, that will diminish your well-being, but it won't cause you to suffer. As I said, ethically, I think our priority should be to get rid of experience below hedonic zero, but one can still have an arbitrarily deep or shallow hedonic range within which to conduct human relationships in society. I sometimes give the example of a transhuman civilization. If our hedonic range today is -10 to 0 to +10, one can imagine a transhuman civilization that's people or organisms span +70 to +100. So in one sense, the hedonic range is greater than anything possible today, but it is nonetheless, even their darkest depths are higher than our peak experiences. I'm not saying it's desirable to have this level of hedonic contrast, but it's an option. One can imagine a society, a civilization that is +90 to +100. Point is, it's going to be optional. I think a lot of people are worried that if society, civilization embraces transhumanist technologies, engineers a world of perpetual bliss that involve giving up their existing values, and it needn't, at least not unless one of your values is the conservation of involuntary suffering.
Yeah, the worry that I would have would be a complete reframing of empathy, and a bit like, have you ever been around a group of people that are on cocaine? I mean, this would be quite a different state space to be in, than pure, well thought out and well implemented hedonic bliss. But there is this sort of island effect in which everybody is talking at one another and not talking to one another, and relationships break down. And I wonder if empathy requires some knowledge of someone else's suffering to have its full spectrum effect of actually caring. Because if everybody's in this state of bliss, I wonder if they would become sort of solo islands of themselves. And okay, your friend, you're at 100 and your friend's down to 70, but he's still pretty good. Like, who really cares? And maybe there's nothing to care about. But this would be, as you say, quite a restructuring of our values, and that scares a lot of people.
Yeah, so it is possible to imagine a future civilization in which essentially everyone enjoys some kind of egotistical cocaine-like high all the time, and it would not be limitless. Possible. I mean, of course, Limitless isn't designed as an image of utopia, but one suspects that the director might have done little experimental psychopharmacology to assist with the movie. I don't know whether future civilization will have cocaine-like states of well-being, but there's another alternative too one can sketch, that of a civilization in which people are effectively loved up all the time, in the sense of MDMA induced being loved up. People who take MDMA ecstasy enjoy both euphoria and a tremendous sense of love and compassion for themselves and for everyone else. It's a sense of I love the world and the world loves me. Empathy and euphoria are possible together. But taking MDMA is not the recipe for a happy world today. The drug is short-acting, it's potentially neurotoxic, there are all kinds of complications because taking MDMA induces all sorts of negative feedback mechanisms of the brain to kick in. But it's a hint of how it's going to be possible to construct a civilization based on intelligent, empathetic, loving bliss. Now, as soon as one goes beyond just the project of getting rid of suffering and starts laying out how one would like society to function, what kind of people one would like to see, it becomes much more problematic, because not everyone is keen on the idea of being loved up on hug drugs all the time. I mean, personally, this would be my conception of a utopian society, but not everyone finds this appealing. But it's, shall we say, it's a case study to consider. Essentially, it's just one of many possible options for future society. But transhumanism at its best is enabling. It's not saying that people should be forced to have any kind of lifestyle. It's not a case of my imposing my values on you or yours. But it's getting rid of involuntary suffering, involuntary aging, and involuntary stupidity, crucially.
Yeah, MDMA is an interesting one because while it does induce the states that you described, the sense of euphoria and love for oneself and love for the world and heightened states of empathy, it can also amplify negative valence if the external circumstances aren't so great. I've experienced this personally. And so to me, that hints at this sort of interplay between consensus reality, society, interpersonal relationships that is still incredibly important for Homo sapiens alongside the pure hedonic set point or hedonic valence wherever they're sitting. But presumably this could also be engineered out. I mean, there are people in society who seem to have no problem being completely asocial. There are the monks that go live in caves for 20 years on their own and don't seem to have, I mean, aside from going a little bit strange, don't seem to suffer the consequences of not seeing anybody for that amount of time. So I guess, as you say, it's transhumanism doesn't seem to prescribe an ideal society. It's more enabling the tools for people to set their own hedonic set point and baseline. But there are a lot of strange configurations that could come out of the engineering, and the engineering itself doesn't necessarily solve all of our problems.
Yes, I mean, we are all born into this world opioid addicts, hooked on endogenous opioids, and most people find prolonged isolation, social isolation, solitary confinement intensely unpleasant. But although we are born opioid addicts, of course, although at their best human relationships yield rewarding release of endogenous opioids, quite frequently all forms of toxicity too. Is essentially endogenous opioid systems need enriching, but they need enriching in such a way that doesn't undermine relationships, but enhances them. And one of the objections to opioids today, even if it were possible to get rid of the problems of tolerance, respiratory depression, is that they make people asocial. Not antisocial, at least not antisocial if they have access to all the opioids they need, but asocial, which is not a problem if you're Robinson Crusoe, but if you have family responsibilities, job, and so forth, this is undesirable.
I have to go back to suffering again, and there's a obligatory question for the audience that will be on everybody's mind, and you would have heard it 1,000 times, I'm sure, but I'm going to ask you again for their sake. What do you say in response to the notion that suffering is an essential part of the human experience?
Well, empirically, this is true, but the question is, does this actually matter? When someone started wearing clothes for the first time, or invented the wheel, if a critic said, this is unnatural, one could say, one could dispute the meaning of the term natural. But does this really matter? In that everything worthwhile about humans today can be preserved, but we can get rid of the nasty stuff. The humans who start wearing clothes, stop harming other sentient beings, become pacifists, cease to be truly human. Well, on some definitions of human, if by human you mean our ancestors on the African savannah 40,000 years ago, yes, but does this matter?
As a society, we seem to value those most that have instrumental or goal-orientated aims and behaviour. What are your thoughts on how we value people?
Oh, that's a tricky one. I mean, there are some societies that value meditation, meditative tranquility, others that value thrusting go-getters, success stories, depending on one's audience, one should stress either the opportunity to enrich motivation, or instead the opportunity for serenity and blissful contentment. As long as there is suffering in the world, I think in one sense it's desirable to be hyper-motivated, to find ways to alleviate and prevent it. But so many of the success stories in our society are a case of flashy consumer goods, status, the house, the car. I could go off on a rant on the perils of materialism. You've heard it before, but so much success in our society involves winners and losers. If some people have high status, it means other people have low status. High status goods, low status goods. And yes, definition of success today is very shallow.
Do you think that the status games that people play is tied to the vast amounts of suffering in the world, and that if the unnecessary suffering was eliminated, the status games would become much more redundant?
Yes, it's possible. I mean, one can be quite conservative about this, in that, as well as massively amplifying default subjective well-being, one can also massively amplify default levels of motivation and desire. Buddhists identify suffering and desire, but that's simplistic. It's frustrated desire that causes suffering, whereas simply having a lot of desires, other things being equal, is a recipe for a rewarding life. Thanks to developments in molecular biology, the actual basis of pure bliss and pure motivation is being teased out. And if you want to boost your level of motivation, then it's a case of amping up mesolimbic dopamine function. Dopamine used to be called the pleasure chemical, the pleasure neurotransmitter, but it now seems that the mesolimbic dopamine system mediates the anticipation of pleasure and reward. I mean, dopamine gives one this sense of things to be done, urgency. And so, yeah, I don't know whether transhumans and posthumans, for the most part, will be both super happy and super motivated, or instead super happy and extremely serene. But yeah, we have the opportunity to be both if we want to, and I mean, if we choose to retain some approximation of our existing preference architecture, if you're a fanatical chess player, you'll still want to become world champion and so on, and losing at chess will diminish your well-being because you are hyper-motivated to win, but it won't make you depressed, disconsolate in the way that losing does today.
What is wireheading, and can you describe the difference between drug-induced valence states and electrically stimulated high valence states, perhaps with some examples?
Slightly complicated. Wireheading used to be described as intracranial self-stimulation of the pleasure centres, but we now know that the pleasure centres, as they were christened when they were discovered by Olds and Milner back in 1954, don't mediate pure bliss, but instead mediate pure desire. So, the term wireheading can be a bit misleading. Is the author intending to allude to states of pure bliss or pure desire? In some ways, pure bliss without any kind of desire at all, which the Buddhist definition of nirvana, is akin to taking heroin, or perhaps heroin with a kappa opioid agonist. Pure bliss, not the slightest desire to do anything or anything to be different. And this is problematic for all sorts of reasons. It's hard to imagine a civilization consisting entirely of wireheads, because wireheads don't want to rear baby wireheads. And likewise, assuming it were possible to get rid of the problems of tolerance, can one imagine a civilization of people who are perpetually blissed out? I mean, not intelligently blissful, but blissed out on the functional equivalent of heroin. And although it may be possible to envisage some such civilization in future, nonetheless, clearly people in such a civilization are not motivated to seek out reproductive opportunities, to nurture offspring. So its societal dynamics, shall we say, are extremely problematic. But one can, it will be in future possible to enjoy all the rewards of wireheading or opioids without the toxic side effects as one would see today. I do think wireheading at least should be an option for victims of intractable depression who aren't effectively treated by today's therapies, but I don't see it as a global option for the problem of suffering. It's just not sociologically credible.
Yeah, I'm imagining a planet of entire wireheads, and that's the entire purpose of the civilization. That would be it'd be quite the sight.
I think it's irrational. It may well be irrational prejudice, but nonetheless, the prejudice is very strong.
Yeah, to this Homo sapien it is.
And somehow one needs to work with the grain of human nature that persuade people that one isn't trying to subvert their values, but instead is trying to work with them.
Yeah. You mentioned motivation before, and dopamine, and these potential future transhumanists that have high hedonic set points, and that have that can choose to have high amounts of motivation or just simply be serene. In my own experience, I've got an interesting complicated relationship with suffering and motivation, and specifically when it ascribes to creating art. I create music, and I create this podcast. And this is where I get a little bit concerned about eliminating suffering for myself, because I'm not convinced that if I was just purely happy that I would have created very much. Maybe half of the amount of work that I've done, or maybe a quarter I would have done in a high valence state. But my overwhelming motivational drive for creating art and this podcast and my other larger projects in my life is what I call it feels like a storm that follows me around, and it's a slow creep of anxiety and suffering that slowly overwhelms me over the course of weeks if I'm not creating anything, and especially if I'm not releasing and publishing anything as pertaining to my career as an artist, and to a certain extent this podcast. This is more of a passion project, the podcast, but I'm not sure that I want to lose the suffering side of that, because it has forced me to do a lot of very good work, and a lot of work that has given me long-term satisfaction and high valence. There might be hiding a more complicated relationship to suffering, and I suppose that the answer you might give is that I would be given the option to retain that suffering, but it would be much better if we had the option to turn it off.
Yes, and we are not talking about coercive bliss. I mean, almost no one is proposing to haul you off and subject you to unlimited lifetime pleasure.
Of bliss.
It's enriching. But I mean, the trickier question is functionality, and that in today, should one encourage writers to be blissful? Well, if writers are blissful, they'll, for the most part, produce a lot of junk. Being ferociously self-critical is almost a precondition to writing anything worthwhile. And likewise, yes, if one is creating music, art, it is essential to retain functionality. But as we know, a revolution in artificial intelligence is unfolding, and increasingly AI is performing humans in ever more cognitive domains, and this is going to be true of the arts, the sciences, and almost everything else. I stress I'm going to qualify the almost, but we can come to that a bit later. But essentially, if it were possible to create art of superhuman brilliance, beauty, would we want to retain the biology of suffering in order that artists can create mediocre art? Or would it be best if we offloaded the production of works of artistic genius, music, literature to AI? I think you can probably guess my answer, but there's another strand to this discussion too, which is, take beauty, for example, that if we are prepared to use neuroscanning, molecular biology, and then genetic interventions, it would be possible to identify the molecular signature of aesthetic experience in the CNS and massively purify and enrich it. And so that people will be able to go through, as one option, throughout their entire lives, finding absolutely everything superhumanly, awesomely beautiful and sublime, with the option, if this is desired, to have gradients of beauty or gradients of sublimity if they want to retain critical insight. So if we're prepared to go down the route for biological genetic interventions, it'd be possible to create a civilization marked by an explosion of artistic aesthetic excellence, far richer than anything possible today. And if such a civilization were to contemplate the the daubings of a previous era, there would be no comparison. So if we're prepared to actually explore their molecular basis in the CNS, yes, we can have arts far richer than anything possible today. So one shouldn't imagine future civilization will be a civilization of blissful Philistines. It's possible, at least, that the era of the arts has scarcely even begun.
I'll push back a little bit on some of that. I mean, this is all coming from the perspective of a Homo sapien in our current world, and not a post-human, which may be a very, very different beast altogether. But from the point of view of a Darwinian Homo sapien living in 2020, the strangest year of my entire life, I'll bring it back to this idea that humans are mythological creatures that very much enjoy story. And I was having this very similar conversation about this on Discord a few weeks ago, because somebody brought up a similar issue that GTP 3 has just been released pretty recently, right? And it's pumping out poetry and prose and literary works in the style of many different authors, and it's scaring the shit out of everybody, especially writers. The point that I made to the guys chatting on Discord was that within art you have, and I learned this from a chat with Robin Hanson, you have intrinsic value and extrinsic value. Now, of course, intrinsic value is the most important. That is the self-evident value of the art. If you look at a classical painting like the Tower of Babel or Michelangelo or something like that, it's self-evident, it's skillful, it's aesthetically, classically beautiful. You don't require a story around the art piece for it to have that value. However, if you add the extrinsic value, which is the storytelling, perhaps the mythology, and often the story of the artist themselves, it can add an extra depth and a whole another dimension of meaning to the artwork. And this is especially true when you're talking about music, because we already have AI generated music, these sort of bots that have created classical songs and some strange sort of electronic music, and people seem to enjoy it and they'll check it out as a novelty. But as far as I can tell at this point, they are not becoming huge hits, and that is because while the music itself might have some intrinsic value, it might be, it might sound good, it might be interesting, it might be pleasing to the ear, it's missing the ephemeral quality of humanness that comes from the extrinsic quality of the artist themselves that is producing the music. So that's my pushback against the idea that that we will lose the function of artists if as soon as AI can pump out art that is as compelling and as convincing as anything that we are creating, because it will lose that extrinsic side. And again, this is coming from myself in 2020. Perhaps our transhumanist or post-human friends in the far future will have a totally different value set and won't really care about the extrinsic value, or perhaps the AI itself will be conscious enough or interesting enough that it has an interesting enough mythology of its own. But just wondering if you have any thoughts on that pushback.
Yeah, it's imagine if one is enjoying an incredibly powerful, soul-stirring musical piece, and the lyrics, it really tugs at one's heartstrings, and then one reflects, well, actually, this is produced by an insentient AI, and I think all classical digital computers are insentient, so there'd be no consciousness there. And will that thought detract from one's enjoyment of this spine-tinglingly good piece of music if one realizes it was just produced by an algorithm? Maybe so. But it's essentially, it would be possible to incorporate AI within oneself, and that though there are scenarios for the intelligence explosion that imagine that essentially, yes, AI is going to be autonomous and go boom and take over, as prefigured by Neuralink. Essentially, anything that AI and AI software can do can be incorporated within you, kind of smart super intelligence on a chip. But if you do have such a neurochip or augmentation, you are going to be able to produce superhumanly sublime works of music, art and literature, and yet they'll come with a depth of feeling. So anyone listening to your work or enjoying your art needn't worry that it's produced by a zombie. I mean, sure, you had a little help from a zombie AI, but it is still coming from within the depths of you.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, we're already helped a lot by the zombie algorithmic AI in music, especially. There's all sorts of tools in the producer suite now that can assist the producer in making music. But yeah, I mean, it speaks to the value and the function of art itself, right? What is the point of art? Art is supposed to speak to the ephemeral qualities or the hidden depths of human existence and emotion. So it's kind of abhorrent to a lot of people if an algorithm just generated it out of preference sets or something, which, to be honest, you could do with a lot of the really bad end of commercial pop music today. You could probably do that. And there, actually, I mean, there's an interesting sort of niche here in Asia, and I think it's specifically Japan. They do have these pop stars that are completely computer generated, composed by humans, but the vocalists are there are these cartoon vocalists that are completely synthesized with software, and they become these giant sort of superstars in Japan. So okay, maybe there is a subset of the population that are more open to having slightly more bizarre extrinsic qualities of art.
This probably confirms the suspicions of some of your audience that transhumanists prone to the Philistine. I think it's more a case that I think beauty can be intensely personal and doesn't really lend itself to verbalization.
Yeah.
Or if it does, in some sense. I don't. If a piece of art needs 20,000 words of narrative to explain to me why it's important or significant and so on, I think it's pretty mediocre. I mean, it should speak to itself, which is why I don't like music where you have to try hard to appreciate it.
Yeah. I'm in a similar vein. I'm much more appreciative of intrinsic qualities of art as well, but sometimes they can enhance. If you check out a particular piece of music and you really love it, and then you find out the backstory afterwards, for me personally, I've found that it can really enhance the appreciation of the piece. There are other people that don't give a shit at the slightest about extrinsic qualities at all, and one of the guys in the Discord said he wouldn't care if it was created by AI if he liked it. He wouldn't bother in the slightest, which someone else in the Discord found abhorrent.
As well as enhancing, of course, the backstory can detract.
Yes,
as a small child, I used to love the military brass band plays, which is pretty bad, and there are some extremely ideologically unsuitable sounds that I actually as I said, one can't appreciate the Horse Vessel song because of its Nazi origins. But it would be, in one sense, it would be better when there is no risk of one's much loved pieces being spoiled by knowing that they were composed by Nazis or the like.
Yeah. Let's go back to civilizing the biosphere, and we've got this story of red tooth and claw nature, animals violently competing and eating one another, but it hasn't necessarily always been this way. It was argued by Peter Godfrey Smith in his excellent book on cephalopods, Other Minds, that in the, I'm going to probably get the pronunciation of this wrong, but in the Edakaran Ediacaran period, about 580 million years ago, animals lacked shells, horns, claws, etc., and seemed to live a rather peaceful existence, in stark contrast to the later Cambrian period in which these weapons and armour first appeared. When you speak of civilizing the biosphere, what do you mean by civilizing? And you spoke to it earlier, but you seem to think we might be able to get back to some kind of pre-Cambrian era of civility and with much less violence, weapons, claws, and shells.
Yeah, so fair question. I mean, one shouldn't allow the pre-Cambrian biosphere was vastly more civilized than what exists today. Nonetheless, one shouldn't romanticize it. Even bacteria have, viruses attacking them. But what essentially I mean by civilized is that, Darwinian ecosystems, as we understand them, essentially starvation, predation, disease, all manner of horrific suffering is actually built into their very nature. And in the abstract, starvation, being eaten alive, being disemboweled might not sound too terrible, but non-human animals, in many cases, are as sentient and sapient as human pre-linguistic toddlers. Essentially most of them come to an extremely sticky end, not suggesting that all non-humans most of the time are suffering, but nonetheless, Darwinian ecosystems are based on ultra-violence and all manner of unspeakable behaviour. And if one watches Disneyfied wildlife documentaries, this is not adequately conveyed. And also one needs to tread quite carefully, because some people have had their most wonderful experiences communing out in the wilds with nature. But essentially, if one understands the nature of life in a Darwinian world, it's just pitiless struggle for survival, it's pretty ghastly to the extent that words can't really convey. And through most of our existence, complaining about the dwelling on the suffering in nature would be like dwelling on the, give an example, second law of thermodynamics or something. It just seemed to be inevitable. But now, essentially, Darwinian ecosystems are optional. That it would be pretty whimsical to suggest that we might compassionately intervene in the rest of the living world while we are systematically abusing non-human animals in factory farms and slaughterhouses. But as the cultured meat revolution takes hold, and after factory farms and slaughterhouses are shut, what then? Are we going to preserve Darwinian ecosystems? And revolution of CRISPR genome editing and synthetic gene drives means that the level of suffering in nature is going to be an adjustable parameter, that we can actually reprogram the entire biosphere. Prudently, one will of course be using artificial self-contained biospheres. First, all manner of ethical dilemmas, complications arise. On a personal level, I don't think it is ethically desirable to conserve recognizable approximations of lions, tigers, crocodiles, snakes, and other Darwinian life forms, but most people are aghast at the thought of a world without lions. But if we are to preserve lions, they're going to need either a bit of genetic tweaking or the availability of, let's say, catnip-flavoured cultured meat and so on to stop them molesting herbivores. Now, there are plenty of critics who would say that a lion that isn't
attacking zebras and is lying down with a lamb, so to speak, is not truly a lion, and there is no knockdown argument against a species essentialist. But it goes back to our discussion of earlier. Are humans who stop harming other sentient beings truly human? I mean, I would say we're both, you and I are both, both human, and likewise with a lion. We can, if we want to, preserve a biblical, a lion or a wolf lying down with the lamb, but we're going to need to tweak lions, lambs, and wolves accordingly to do so. Other big strand, if we are to civilize the rest of the biosphere, is going to be fertility regulation. This can be done in the case of large terrestrial vertebrates with tools such as cross-species immunocontraception. In the case of the invertebrates, small rodents and the like, one would use tunable gene drives of varying efficiencies. Essentially, we're not going to run out of computer power. It's a question of choice. How much pain, misery, suffering, despair, asphyxiation and being eaten alive do we want to conserve in the rest of the living world? And any ethically responsible person, I would say, I would argue, should be saying zero, that Darwinian ecosystems are an abomination, and that if we were to encounter an advanced civilization that had eliminated predation, for example, that would we, if we encountered them, urge them to reintroduce? Asphyxiation might not sound too bad, but as any, people who've experienced being waterboarded, it is unspeakably vile, and the world doesn't need to be that way.
Jonathan Balcombe, who's a vegan biologist, and he's on some ethics committees and things in the US. He was a guest on this podcast some years ago, and I think he would agree about civilizing the biosphere if it could be done well, but his argument is that animals in the wild actually experience a lot of joy and a lot of high valence states, and perhaps they experience joy and high valence states most of the time. Not all animals, and this is a big generalization, but he had a lot of issue with the very violent nature documentaries that pretty much only show lions attacking a zebra, and the really red tooth and claw nature of the biosphere. And his observations and his books contain countless anecdotes of very interesting interactions between different animals, and animals demonstrating emotional capacity and abilities and capabilities that are quite astonishing and are quite surprising for most people to read. So I would be interested to hear you two talk about the difference. He thinks it's a lot more joyful. You think it's filled with a lot more suffering. I wonder if there's some middle ground there.
I mean, there is a great deal of joy in the living world, just as humans experience a great deal of joy. And if one is a temperamentally happy person, one will be thinking of the joys of nature. Animals, non-human animals, gambling, frolicking away, having sex, all the good stuff. But there is frightful stuff going on too. And just as if a friend right now were drowning, you wouldn't go on partying and think of all the good things that were happening in the world. You would be single-mindedly focused on rescuing your friend. I think we have an obligation to single-mindedly focus on the horrific suffering that is occurring. I don't think we should then stop at getting all life above hedonic zero. Yeah, there'll be all manner of fabulous delights in future, but that's not what's morally urgent.
Yeah. So where do you draw the ethical line of what is okay to eat and cultivate, and where do you believe sentience creeps into animals? I asked the same sort of question to Jonathan, and we couldn't figure out if sentience sort of crept into animals at the tardigrade level or somewhere a bit below that or somewhere a bit higher that, and if sentience is the best kind of measure of where we should feel it's okay to consume another living being on planet Earth.
We could at this stage go into a heavy philosophical discussion about the nature and origins of consciousness, and I take very seriously the idea that consciousness could be fundamental, that quantum field theory describes fields of sentience rather than insentience, but that's pretty left field, crazy stuff. I think what distinguishes systems that have any kind of moral significance isn't consciousness per se, it's phenomenal binding and possession of a pleasure-pain axis. That, in the case of your enteric nervous system, the brain and the guts, there are you have 500 million odd nerve cells, a tremendously sophisticated information processing system, and yet, to the best of our knowledge, your enteric nervous system is not a subject of experience, and the same is true of plants, digital computers, though that is controversial, and all manner of other information processing systems. So whereas I think a worm, or at least the ganglia of a worm, is sentient, is subject to experience and has moral status, I don't worry about plants, for example. So plants encased in thick cellulose cell walls, plants have not evolved an energetically expensive nervous system. They are not unified subjects of experience, even if you believe, as I say, it's a possibility I take seriously no more, even if you believe consciousness is fundamental in the world. So essentially animals, and here I'm going to the emphasis on multicellular animals matter. Nothing else really does, not intrinsically. There are all sorts of complications that I have skimmed over, but essentially. But the existence of a pleasure-pain axis, without a pleasure-pain axis, nothing would matter at all. Its origins are very deep in the Precambrian. Some very, very simple creatures, insects, other invertebrates have opioid, dopamine systems, have a functional pleasure-pain axis. It's extremely ancient. But systems that are not phenomenally bound and don't have a pleasure-pain axis, I don't think they intrinsically matter at all.
The pleasure-pain axis is essentially a signaling system, right?
It has been harnessed by evolution via natural selection for signaling purposes. Yes, it's something like neuropathic pain doesn't signal anything. And
anything
if
meaningful.
You wire up, you can wire up the reward centers and just indiscriminate bliss, and that doesn't signal anything. But yes, evolution has harnessed the pleasure-pain axis, and on its own, sort of relatively good or relatively bad might not be too useful. But evolution has been the so-called encephalization of emotion, such that people can be happy or sad at extraordinarily complex, subtle phenomena, seemingly at many times removed from any kind of obvious fitness, cost, or benefit. But the encephalization of emotion has been tremendously fitness enhancing for animals over hundreds of millions of years.
I spoke to Jeremy Sherman last year, and his work is in Origins of Life, along with Terence Deacon. And I spoke to him about superorganisms, and I'm interested in your thoughts. So if we're looking at a plant, okay, I understand that if you take the plant out of the ground and it's just a plant, it might not have this pleasure-pain axis, or it may not have the the building blocks to be a unified subject of experience. But what if that plant is a part of a huge rainforest ecosystem that includes mycelium and other animals and insects that are all also using signaling mechanisms in a vast, large network? Is there anything of interest there?
Only indirectly, as far as I'm concerned, that only sentient beings intrinsically matter. And so, yeah, all kinds of non-sentient things matter in all kinds of subtle and complex ways, but only insofar as they impact directly or indirectly on the lives of sentient beings. And although one can speak of superorganisms or the intelligence of an ant colony, for example, an ant colony is not a unified subject of experience. So the colony per se doesn't matter. Oh, also, I would argue anyway.
You were talking about how nearly everything could have a certain degree of sentience, and what matters is once the phenomenal binding problem is addressed and you've got a unitary single subject of experience. But how does this apply to, if we go back to this rainforest analogy, like the Amazon rainforest or something like that, where there's this huge, vast network of interplay, much like a human body is a huge, vast network of trillions of cells and bacteria and all sorts of different things. Do you entertain any notions that a large system like that could have some kind of unified subjective experience?
My working assumption is monistic physicalism and the unity of science. And essentially, molecular biology reduces to quantum chemistry, which reduces to fundamental physics. And if any phenomenon can't be reduced in this fashion, if strong emergence is real, essentially all bets are off. To give an example, the population of the United States, 330 million odd skull-bound American minds, if they are configured any way you want, fast electromagnetic signaling, implement any computation you like, does a continental subject of experience switch on, or are they simply 330 million skull-bound American minds? I can't rule out the possibility that strong emergence that is not explained by the underlying physics is real, but it's spooky and akin to magic. And if strong emergence is a feature of reality, then all bets are off. Essentially, the scientific world picture is mistaken.
Okay.
The big, or in fact I should say the gigantic complication here is consciousness and phenomenal binding, in that if chemists and physicists understand the fundamental nature of matter and energy, then why aren't we zombies? And if neuroscientists correctly understand the brain as 86 billion membrane-bound discrete nerve cells that communicate with each other across chemical and electrical synapses, if they correctly understand their nervous systems, why aren't we at most micro-experiential zombies? So in that sense, orthodox materialist physicalism and orthodox neuroscience are, in a sense, empirically inadequate. But with those immense complications, as I said, I'm very suspicious of someone who claims the existence of any kind of irreducible phenomenon that doesn't supervene on the underlying physics. I think ultimately physics explains everything.
Mm-hmm. So what distinction would you make? This is just one of these things that I kind of wish was true, but I also suspect isn't. This idea of superorganisms. But what would you say to someone that makes an analogy between, going back to the rainforest example, that makes an analogy between this vast interconnected network in a rainforest and this vast interconnected network in a skull-bound human brain.
Well, I'm happy to go off on a spiel now. Which
Go
you
for
may
it.
want to cut, but no, essentially, I think that phenomenal binding is classically impossible, and that if you have 86 billion membrane-bound nerve cells, all you can ever have is a micro-experiential zombie. And at least when one is awake, not in a dreamless sleep, one is not a micro-experiential zombie. So I take seriously a version of a quantum mind hypothesis. Most forms of quantum mind involve dynamical collapse, the so-called collapse of the wave function. The Penrose-Hameroff orchestrated objective reduction theory is probably best known, but I'm skeptical of any new theory of physics. I think all that exists is the unitary Schrödinger evolution, and if one were to probe the mind brain at a scale not of milliseconds but of femtoseconds or attoseconds, then one would not see classical neurons as we understand them under light microscopy, using a light microscope, but instead one would find neuronal superpositions of distributed feature processors. Now, the reason most people who have considered this conception of quantum mind would not take it seriously is that the effective lifetime of neuronal superpositions, or cat states in the CNS, it must be femtoseconds or attoseconds, which is intuitively a reductio ad absurdum of quantum mind. But if one takes A, the intrinsic nature argument seriously, and B, the completeness of unitary-only quantum mechanics, then it's possible to come up with an empirically adequate account of our phenomenally bound minds. Now, the intrinsic nature argument, it stretches all the way back ultimately to Schopenhauer, but essentially says that science, ultimately physics, is silent on the intrinsic nature of the physical, the fire in the equations. Now, intuitively, that fire, the intrinsic nature of a quantum field, is non-experiential. But if so, we face the hard problem of consciousness, the binding problem, the problem of non-redundant causal efficacy, this horror story of problems. Whereas if consciousness discloses the intrinsic nature of the physical, the fire in the equations, i.e. if non-materialist physicalism is true, one actually has an empirically adequate account of the world without any kind of strong emergence that embraces all the phenomena of consciousness, but also has all the explanatory success and power of traditional scientific materialism. Now, until recently, the intrinsic nature argument was pretty marginal, but for what it's worth, it has been gaining ground, gaining traction in academia. Galen Strawson, most recently, Phil Goff, Galileo's era. If I sound like an advocate, I don't mean to sound like an advocate, it's merely a view I take very seriously. But if one is focused on providing an empirically adequate scientific account of the world without sacrificing monistic physicalism and the unity of science, there are ways to do this. And critically, and this is the question one should ask anyone with some kind of theory of consciousness or binding, This is a scientific question that I've been tentatively arguing that the basis of phenomenal binding and moral status is non-classical, and essentially it'd be possible to use molecular matter wave interferometry to test this conjecture. If it is really the case that what naively is synchronous patterns of distributed feature processes firing in the CNS is actually individual neuronal superpositions, cat states, then the non-classical interference signature will tell us that I think you and I are essentially a bunch of cat states. But it's not necessary for anyone interested in the Abolitionist Project or transhumanism to buy into these pretty idiosyncratic ideas about the nature of consciousness and binding. But it's not entirely self-indulgent exploring these ideas, because binding is a major problem for neuroscience and for ethics. And without binding, you haven't got a mind. You may or may not have patterns of mind dust, but they don't intrinsically matter. And I would say that a plant doesn't matter because a plant isn't a subject of experience. A classical digital computer doesn't matter because even if rather whimsically one were to replace the ones and zeros of a classical digital computer with discrete micropixels of experience and execute the code, one still wouldn't have a unitary subject of experience. So these questions are important, but essentially all the options are crazy. Eric Schwitzgiebel has this term crazyism. One shouldn't really apologize for having a crazy theory of consciousness or a crazy theory of binding. One should only apologize if one's theory doesn't actually have any testable predictions.
Or if it turns out to be incorrect.
Well, it's
that's what Andre says.
I mean, if Mystic Meg claims that she's she can commune with the gods and factorize 1,000-digit numbers or something like that, one can philosophize with her. But if she confounds us all, well, yes, essentially our conceptual scheme is wrong. And though I don't have a great deal of faith in my own theories and ideas on consciousness, I have pretty strong conviction that whatever the correct solution to the hard problem is, whatever the correct solution to the binding problem is, that it will yield novel, precise, experimentally testable predictions. This is very Popperian, it probably sounds, but it's not like string theory. I mean, string theorists with some plausibility can say that, look, they're dealing with energy regimes far outside anything going to be possible with particle accelerators for thousands of years and so on. I mean, they have an excuse, but consciousness and binding are about as intimate and empirical as they get. So stop anyone short with a theory of consciousness and ask what predictions it makes.
Back to the ethics side of things and the veganist side of things. This is a scenario, it might be a straw man, but it's fun to explore anyway. Vegans don't want to eat anything that's the produce of animals, but a vegan may be a natalist. They may think of having children or think it's a good idea or morally okay to have a child. And this is an incoherent kind of equivalence. So I'm wondering if you're anti-natalist, is there any coherence to this argument that I'm making? Is it just a blatant straw man? Thoughts?
Oh, Ryan, you raise a lot of issues there. I mean, anti-natalism, I'm only a soft anti-natalist rather than a hard anti-natalist, in that personally I don't think it's ethically justifiable to bring more life and involuntary suffering into the world, but I'm only a soft anti-natalist because the nature of selection pressure means that too many people think they have an obligation to go forth and multiply, and the main effect of simply not having children is to impose selection pressure against any form of anti-natalism. So unfortunately, I don't think anti-natalism is a solution to the problem of suffering, unlike David Benatar. In the case of non-human animals, I mean, yeah, essentially, if one takes the Abolitionist Project seriously, it's not just a case of abolishing suffering in humans. We have an obligation to use the tools of AI and biotechnology to permanently get rid of suffering throughout the living world. And yeah, other things being equal, it's clearly better that non-human animals are treated with less cruelty and less suffering. But the point is that we shouldn't be harming them at all. We should be helping them. Now, one can imagine missionaries trying to convert cannibals, and one of the more sophisticated cannibals says, well, what about a baby that has died naturally? Is there anything wrong with eating the baby? And one can say something similar with roadkill or something. But the sensible missionary, rather than getting involved in this kind of casuistry, will say no, eating people is wrong. And likewise, I think it is best to uphold the sanctity of life in law, human and non-human life, and have this prohibition against harming not just humans but non-human animals, except in exceptional circumstances. And yeah, that this really should be enshrined in law, that we should have the same horror about animal abuse as we do child abuse. Clearly, cows or non-human animals who lead free-range existence is their lives better than factory-farmed non-humans who are tail-docked, de-beaked, castrated, all manner of other horrors, and then slaughtered. Yeah, it's clearly better in some sense to be free-range than abused in factory farms, but nonetheless we should, slaughterhouses should not be legal. They are a terrible stain on human civilization. And probably one of the said, rather than calling for a complete anti-speciesist revolution, which may take centuries, from a campaigning perspective, it may be better to focus on getting rid of slaughterhouses. According to one study that I didn't believe till I heard it had been replicated, 47% of Americans, when asked, would favour getting rid of slaughterhouses. I'm not asking them, would you go vegan or even vegetarian, but just would you favour abolishing slaughterhouses? And it's the weak link in the apparatus of oppression. And if we can get slaughterhouses shut, all else will follow.
Yeah, I'm with you there. And in that scenario, I was meaning a milk cow and a egg chicken, not a meat or.
I'm less worried about the personal purity issue. It's not a case of being personally pure. I mean, yes, ideally one should be personally pure, but that's not the real reason to be vegan. The real reason to be vegan is to make sure everyone else is vegan too, and getting the death factories shut and outlawed.
Yeah. All right, I've got a couple of lofty questions. Are you interested in questions of things such as God? And the other way to describe God would be highest value. John Lilly, of course, had all these different conceptions of God in his book, Simulations of God. God is sex, God is money, God is power, God is the mystery, God is the omnipotent, God is the creator, etc., etc., etc. What is God or highest value for you?
think they are rather different questions in that if there is a God or a supreme architect or a simulator, then my own conception of reality is misconceived, and I don't know what else will be misconceived too. Taking a perspective of secular rationalism, essentially, what is the nature of value? This would take us into we can discuss the nature of value realism if you like, but let's explore the question of spirituality. In that, though I don't believe in the existence of God, I do believe in the reality of spiritual phenomena, and if one is religiously or spiritually inclined, rather than putting up with our legacy wetware, which involves all manner of states that are distinctly unspiritual, it will be possible genetically, biochemically, neurologically to investigate the signature of spiritual experience of divinity, the numinous, if you like, and massively enrich and amplify it, just as one can with the experience of beauty or bliss. And so if you are a spiritually inclined person, this message may be more congenial, that although a lot of scientific rationalists assume that the future is secular, it's also possible that transhumans and posthumans will be super spiritual and spend their lives in rapturous spiritual ecstasies, for example, that are far richer than anything that's today enjoyed by, let's say, temporal lobe epileptics.
You're such a salesman, David.
Well, it's the case of no one's audience, and though I'm not really a salesman because I haven't got the manner. But sure, if one is talking to a Buddhist, don't say you think Buddha was wrong about some of his metaphysics or desire is suffering. Quote him on, I teach one thing only, suffering is at the end of suffering. May all that of life be delivering with suffering. With a Christian, don't tell a Christian that you think their metaphysics is fundamentally wrong. Stress the commonalities. Isaiah, peaceable kingdom, lion and the wolf. Jesus, miracle and the loaves and the fishes, prefiguring in vitro meat. I'm not suggesting to being insincere. It's not productive triggering people's gladiatorial responses.
Yeah, I'm with you there. Can you define what you mean by spirituality there? In this discussion of God, let's leave aside this idea of an architect and more of a ever-present, eternal, infinite consciousness thing that just permeates the entire universe. That doesn't necessarily orchestrate or build anything. It's just a connectedness that permeates everything.
Well, I can believe in God, or I might say the devil in that sense.
Yeah, right.
That's just wave function monism together with the intrinsic nature argument. In terms, what does one mean by spirituality? Just as phenomenal redness, it can't be defined in terms of anything more primitive, but nonetheless, although one can't define it in terms of anything more primitive, one wouldn't say phenomenal redness is meaningless or doesn't exist. Phenomenal redness is real. And likewise, the kind of experience one would describe as spiritual, that is as real as the taste of cinnamon. Now, many religious people would want to attach some kind of transcendent meaning above and beyond the empirical significance of spiritual states. But I would focus on given our ignorance of consciousness, I would just focus on this empirical spirituality, that not everyone has experienced spiritual states, but if you do, you'll know they're real.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I just quote I think it was a hippie, anonymous hippie. It's not hard to hear voices, it's knowing whether they tell you the truth. And if one goes beyond this purely subjective experience to claiming a further significance, here one must be much more wary. And so someone who takes DMT and experiences entities and the like, in one sense, the experience is completely real, it's part of the architecture of your mind. But if you think, well, there are really other subjects of experience beyond you, then I would beg to differ.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's the quandary of subjective reality and consensus reality, and they have very different rules. One swaps the rules around at one's peril, I suppose. Someone very close to me has a question for you, and she'd like to know how you define the soul.
I'm skeptical of the existence of souls as commonly understood. On the other hand, I'm skeptical of the existence of classical matter and energy as commonly understood would be a diplomatic response to. But yes, let's just say quantum states are not what they seem, and that there are many aspects of quantum states that we do not understand.
Okay. I had a great chat with her for several hours once, and we both narrowed down in a reductionist manner what exactly the soul could be and what its function would be, and we could not figure it out what it would be in a secular manner. But I think she's come up with some new ideas, so I'm going to chat with her on Sunday about that. I'll let you know. But I was in your camp of being very skeptical of a metaphysical soul, because I could not figure out for the life of me what its function was. We've explored personal identity on this podcast with the likes of Daniel Ingram, the emergency medicine physician and founder of Dharma Overground. And we've also explored with it for the first time with Andres and Qualia Computing. And the framework that we've used is these modes of personal identity of closed individualism, empty individualism, and open individualism. And they are combined with the two theories of time, which are presentism and eternalism. And Andres tells me that you are a empty individualist, eternalist. Firstly, is that correct? Is it a accurate description of your view of personal identity? And secondly, perhaps we should attack each of those one at a time, if it is true, and get to the bottom of that.
Tentatively, yes, I'm skeptical of enduring personal identity, or rather, if one claims that there is such a thing as an enduring metaphysical ego, then one is using identity in a different sense from the straightforward logical sense of identity, in which if A equals B, if everything is true of A, it's also true of B. And that is not true of, one's namesake who went to sleep the night before. I think enduring identity over time is a fiction. It's very useful fiction. I'm not a skeptic about the unity of the self, the so-called what philosophers call the synchronic unity of the self, as distinct from the diachronic unity over time. I think right now you are a unified subjective experience, and this is a very deep scientific mystery, but this is a very, very thin form of the self, given that the effective lifetime of here and now is so short. I'm technically an empty individualist. I think open individualism probably leads to better people, so I'm always delighted if I learn someone is an open individualist. Closed individualism is more common, and if I'm not discussing philosophy like most people, I lapse into closed individualist lingo because it's pervasive in our conceptual scheme.
Yeah. For those that don't know, empty individualist ideals is the notion that you're a time slice of experience, that is your personal identity. Open individualism is that we are all the same, and closed individualism is that you exist when you're born and you cease to exist when you die. There are several variations of that, such as afterlife, etc. Buddhism is closely linked with empty individualism. How much of an empty individualist are you then? Because if it's a time slice that could go right back to the briefest moment possible in the physical universe, or it might be something as you know, it could be a day, it could be a few minutes. How wide does your empty individualism go, or narrow?
Well, given I don't think phenomenal binding is classically explicable, and the credible effective lifetime of neuronal superpositions in the CNS is probably femtoseconds or less. This is an extremely thin conception of personal identity, but in theory one could give them a superscript or something, or even in theory their own their own names. But in some sense they all tenselessly exist in the universal wave function.
What's a femtosecond?
10 to the minus 15, which is
Wow.
Eternity is just a kind of an attosecond, 10 to the minus 18 of a second.
Right.
And what should go into zeptoseconds and that vein. But this sounds incredibly philosophical, but ultimately these are scientific questions. As I said, the technical challenges of using molecular matter wave interferometry to probe the CNS are huge, but I don't think this question will be discussed in 100 years' time. Well, essentially, quantum mind will be either vindicated or refuted.
It's the high-level meditators in Buddhism, such as Daniel Ingram, can directly experience empty individualism, perhaps not down to the thinness that you've described in those very small seconds, but Daniel describes up to the level of somewhere around 60 hertz of sort of these frames of experience that you can eventually train and feel phenomenally, and in each of those sort of frames you are a new person, essentially, according to Buddhism. So he's an empty individualist as well, and he takes that from experience, which is, I find, quite interesting. Let's tackle eternalism. Andres said in our podcast that he hates the idea of empty individualist eternalism, because that would mean that any moment of suffering would be held in eternity, and it could be the most excruciating suffering, and it doesn't dissipate into the unreal past as presentism would assume. I'm wondering if you can expand a little bit on eternalism. You've talked about your ontology there, but is there anything else that you could say about it?
The necessary thing one needs to say, it's not just throat clearing, that we do not understand reality, and I don't understand reality, and it is possible that our existing scientific world picture could be mistaken in ways that are simply beyond our conceptual scheme. That said, if one takes Einstein's theory of general relativity, it leads very naturally to the so-called block universe, in which all here and now tenselessly exist. And though it's not an ultimate theory, if one treats quantum mechanics as fundamental, and Hilbert space as, if one is a Hilbert space realist, that lends itself to some kind of eternalism too. It's very difficult to make sense of some kind of presentism or objective becoming. So rather depressing.
True hellscapes would exist in an eternalist reality. So I very much hope, alongside Andres, that we are present. That presentism is real.
Essentially, I think that as ethical agents, our obligation is to do literally everything we can to eliminate suffering in our forward light cone, and then essentially forget about any suffering that we are sure that rational agents can't do anything about. And there are all kinds of exotic scenarios of backward causation and so forth that have been explored, but that would take us off into a very large tangent.
All right, I've got a couple of somewhat random questions and a couple of fun questions to finish off. GTP3, I assume you're familiar with it?
Familiar, not in the sense of deep understanding of code or anything, but yes. Extremely impressive, and this trend is going to continue. I think essentially that artificial intelligence is going to be eclipsing humans in ever more cognitive domains. So far, yes, you've heard this before. But nonetheless, in some sense, I think AI is profoundly stupid and invincibly ignorant, and will never be able to explore different state spaces of consciousness and devise vocabularies for talking about altered state spaces of consciousness, cannot solve the binding problem. And so, though in one sense AI is staggering, if one could flash forward 50 or 100 years, Watson 10 or whatnot, it would be jaw-dropping. In another sense, AI is profoundly stupid, and what is truly cognitively powerful, or will be truly cognitively powerful, is when that we can enjoy kind of super intelligence embedded in a neurochip, so that you will be able to experience a rich diversity of consciousness, explore psychedelia and multiple state spaces of consciousness that no human has ever explored before, but you will also have narrow super intelligence too.
Are you bullish on Neuralink?
Do I intend to cash in my 100,000 share options or something? Essentially, I think a lot of it is hype that Elon Musk and his team underestimate some of the technical challenges, but nonetheless, the important, more kind of philosophical point is that, rather than thinking of post-human superintelligence as alien, that essentially superintelligence is going to be us, or rather our descendant stroke successors. I say us in a rather loose sense, given my skepticism about enduring personal identity, but consciousness, rather than just being some minor detail in the history of the universe, is really the key to the plot. But AI is going to massively augment and enrich the capacity of sentient beings, explore the nature of mind and states of consciousness. So yeah, I think Neuralink prefigures what is to come.
What might a post-human David Pearce be like? Is there anything that you would enjoy? Any kind of enhancements if we had Neuralink? Perhaps if you'd woken up in 500 years out of a cryonics tank? This is just a fun question.
Well, in a sense, it wouldn't really be me. Using the same name creates the illusion one would be talking about the same person. But even a DP that was sustainably happy would be a radically alien creature. And in terms of, I would essentially, as well as learning new things, I would like to forget a lot of old things, not least the existence of Darwinian life and suffering. I mean, reality appalls me. Mm-hmm. But we need to be extremely careful before aiming for ignorance. We mustn't achieve ignorance prematurely. This might seem to go against the grain. I mean, at different points of my work, I discuss the nature of post-human superintelligence, but I think post-human superintelligence is going to choose to be selectively ignorant of things. I mean, just as to a lesser degree. I mean, you are ignorant of the Dark Ages, very little about them, and given that we can't change the Dark Ages, that makes sense. And so, I don't think post-human superintelligence is going to want to dwell on the existence of the Darwinian horror story that led up to it.
Will you be jumping in a cryonics tank? Or being dropped into one?
I would aim for cryothanasia rather than cryonics, because if you wait to the age 95 or whatnot, chances are you'll be pretty gaga. How does this tie in with my lack of faith in any enduring metaphysical egos? No, essentially, I see the role of cryonics and cryothanasia as defanging death, and death worries a lot of people. And if instead of Grandpa's ashes being scattered to the winds, instead it was a case of visiting Grandpa in the cryonics tank. In other words, if cryonics were opt out and cryothanasia opt in, it wouldn't totally defang death. Nonetheless, it would transform death as we understand it today. And it's more a case of, given that I do strenuously urge this kind of cryonics revolution until we can get rid of the awful disease we call aging, I would feel a hypocrite not going down this route. Whether any post-human superintelligence would consider it ethically justifiable to reanimate me from the tank, I'm extremely skeptical, and if they did, it wouldn't really be me that was being recreated. But nonetheless, the sense of hypocrisy if one doesn't practice what one preaches. I mean, when I actually depart, I don't know, nothing very imminent, but nonetheless, there are a few people, something like Freeman Dyson could have been going strong well into his 90s. In practice, most people enter a decline long before then. So I wouldn't intend to hang around.
When you say it wouldn't be you that would wake up at the other end, is that the same assumption that when you wake up tomorrow, you're a new person as well?
Yeah, I mean, when one wakes up in the morning, unless one is a philosopher, one doesn't undergo a kind of metaphysical crisis of identity. Am I really the person who fell asleep last night? And when in the year 2200 or whatnot, one's namesake wakes up. Likewise, one may well feel, or one's namesake may well have on a hyper-authentic sense of this is the real me. One's sense of authenticity or identity can be arbitrarily amplified or diminished. So same with something like MDMA, although MDMA does induce profoundly altered states in one sense, a sense of beauty and love and compassion for oneself and others, it will also induce, typically again, a sense of authenticity. This is the real me. And today's states of derealization and depersonalization, though not normally under that name, are quite common, whereas in future it will be possible to have hyper-real, hyper-personal states and hyper-authenticity. States of derealization and depersonalization will go into this great dustbin of mental disorders from the Darwinian era.
Do you think this experience of hyper-authenticity is pointing to something that is indeed ontologically more real or more authentic to the human that is experiencing it, or is it simply a subjective state?
Yeah, I don't think literally reality admits of degrees or anything like that. Something's either real or it isn't. But and I think hedonic tone is the critical variable here. In that, yes, if one's hedonic tone is positive, one, instead of feeling weird, will have a mystical state and report it as being mystical. Whereas if one's hedonic tone is negative, one might use the language of depersonalization, derealization, and so forth. But in a strict philosophical or scientific sense, all equally real.
Yeah, I've always wondered if there's some kind of equivalence to attraction towards ultimate entropy and dissolving into nothingness being equivalated with negative valence, and life itself seemingly wanting to be use entropy against itself and be negentropic, to have some sort of equivalence to these feelings of love and authenticity, and if there's something there at a deeper level.
This will get us into heavy metaphysical waters.
This is just potentially my naive, slightly spiritual side speaking. So feel free to answer it or not.
In one sense, I'm optimistic in that I think it may well be possible to crack the hard problem, the binding problem, the problem of causal efficacy, and so forth. But in another sense, I'm very pessimistic in that I don't think we have even begun to explore the nature of consciousness, and by consciousness I incline to mean the intrinsic nature of the physical, that there are billions, trillions, possibly far more of radically alien state spaces of consciousness as different from waking as dreaming consciousness or waking consciousness from LSD consciousness, that we are currently incapable of accessing or instantiating, and who knows what we're missing. I mean, though if one is blind or deaf, one has kind of privative terms to describe what one is lacking. We don't have privative terms to discuss what we are lacking for these altered state spaces of consciousness. And so, the future holds profound conceptual revolutions, as radical as anything from the scientific revolution or Newtonian paradigm or quantum theory. And talking emptily of paradigm shifts and revolutions, it doesn't actually signify much. I don't really know what I'm talking about. None of us do when it comes to future states of consciousness.
Yeah.
I mean, having said that, there is one qualification here, in that though most forms of Darwinian consciousness, I think, will
disappear into the dustbin of history. I do think the pleasure-pain axis, in some sense, is the axis of value and disvalue, and that though I don't pretend to know what post-humans will spend their lives doing or the nature of their consciousness in one sense, I do predict that they will be sublimely blissful, and these states will empirically feel super valuable by their very nature. So that would cut against the what I was saying about our ignorance of altered states.
If you could inhabit the consciousness of any animal for a day, what would it be and why?
For a day? Oh, good heavens. Well, in spite of being, I'm making this up as I go along, but in spite of being a crashing prude and celibate, there is, how do you pronounce it, the Anti-Natalist, this marsupial that eventually mates for 12 or 13 days non-stop before it physically disintegrates. And though I would, yes, as I said, I would like to tell you, some tale of uplifting spirituality in terms of being able to experience raw bliss, given that no humans, to my knowledge, spend their lives in perpetual opiated states, whereas these unusual marsupials are blissed out for 12 or 14 days. I should add, though, that I'm, until 10 seconds ago, this hadn't even occurred to me, so I don't spend my my days dreaming of orgiastic debauches or anything.
I think that might be my favourite answer to that one. I ask that to nearly every
I was
guest,
wondering if it ought to be cut out in the grounds that it was unsuitable, but...
only if you want it cut out, but otherwise...
No, I'm more worried about the fact I was mispronouncing... Is it anti-right? I don't know how to pronounce the name, but...
I'll add a link in the show notes. All right, what's next for David Pearce and Humanity Plus?
All the separate questions. Back in 1998, Nick Bostrom and I set up the World Transhumanist Association, which is now Humanity Plus. And though the influence of transhumanist ideas has exploded, the actual transhumanist movement itself is fragmented in 1,001 ways. As you may have gathered, I'm most focused on one particular strand of transhumanism. This is the Abolitionist Project, Biohappiness Revolution. Essentially, as long as I am capable of being intellectually productive, I hope to fly the flag for this particular strand of transhumanism. But most transhumanists are probably more focused on either superintelligence or super longevity, or both. I mean, there are some transhumanists who care about all three supers, or who are focused on the problem of suffering, but Humanity Plus and different transhumanist parties and other transhumanist organizations, shall we say, there is a multitude of different currents to transhumanism. The Transhumanist Declaration of 1998 and dated in 2007 upholds our commitment to the well-being of all sentience, and essentially most, but not all, transhumanists would support this, but it's item 7 out of 8. I would clearly put it first. But on a slightly different note, I think it's more productive to focus on what actually unites all transhumanists, and the vision of a transhumanist civilization of super intelligence, super longevity, and super happiness, I think, is a noble
and inspired one. And if you interview other transhumanists, many would add a fourth or more super, but personally I think that if one has a notion of full spectrum super intelligence, then the idea of super love or super compassion or super cooperation is embraced in the notion of full spectrum super intelligence. So yeah, essentially I think we are stepping stones to something better.
And how can people find you and your work?
Well, my original website is hedweb.com, hedweb.com, and yeah, back in 1995 I wrote this online manifesto, the Hedonistic Imperative, calling for the use of biotech to get rid of suffering throughout the living world. And most of my material can be found on hedweb.com. There's a bunch of other websites too, if you're interested. Like most people, I participate in social media, Hedonistic Imperative Facebook group. My Twitter handle is Webmaster Dave. But yeah, if anyone has any follow-ups that you'd like to see tackled, yeah, drop me a line and I'll do my fallible best to answer.
David, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Ryan, thank you very much for having me. Infinite bliss.